Time for Mrs. Noodlekugel again. We are in chapter 5, and just to give you a little review, Nick and Maxine have gone inside Mrs. Noodlekugel's house. They've met her talking cat, Mr. Fuzzface, who can dance and talk and cook and is learning the piano. And he has served them tea and cookies, and they were calling the mice to come have tea and cookies with them when we ended chapter 4. So chapter 5. 4 fat mice appeared and stood shyly in the doorway. Come in, Mrs. Noodlekugel said. We have visitors and cookies. To Nick and Maxine, she said, all these mice have won prizes. They are prize-winning mice. I didn't know they gave prizes to mice, Nick said. Oh, they do, Mrs. Noodlekugel said. The mice scampered up the tablecloth and sat in a row at the edge of the table. Mrs. Noodlekugel tore a paper napkin into 4 squares. She handed one square to each mouse, who tucked it under their chins. So it sounds like these mice have pretty good manners. You can see a small picture of the mice getting ready to eat their cookie crumbs at the table. Mr. Fuzzface came to work with me when I was working on the railroad, Mrs. Noodlekugel said. He was a railroad cat. In those days, he could not speak a word of English. Could you, Mr. Fuzzface? Not a word, Mr. Fuzzface said. And you taught him to speak? Nick asked. She did, Mr. Fuzzface said. She was very patient. Cats have trouble with consonants, you see. I gave him exercises, Mrs. Noodlekugel said. Exercises? Maxine asked. I had to say, jingle, jungle, jangle, joker 100 times, Mr. Fuzzface said. And monkeys make Monopoly monotonous. And now he speaks perfectly, Mrs. Noodlekugel said. You are too kind, Mr. Fuzzface said. While she was talking, Mrs. Noodlekugel poured out cups of tea for Nick and Maxine and tiny cups the size of thimbles for the mice. Mr. Fuzzface handed cookies around and broke off small pieces for the mice. The children noticed that the mice appeared to have trouble finding the pieces of cookie. They had to sniff with their noses and feel around with their tiny fingers, and when they broke off crumbs to eat, they went to put them in their noses and eyes as often as they did into their mouths. So the mice it doesn't look like they can see the crumbs very well. They're sniffing around and then they're picking up a crumb, and sometimes they try to stick it in their eye or up their nose instead of in their mouth. These mice are farsighted, Mrs. Noodlekugel said. That means they can't see up close very well. But they enjoy tea parties. Oh, that's the end of chapter 5 already. That was a fast chapter. Hang on for chapter 6 a different day.